The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult with your financial advisor. The sad death of legendary actor Gene Hackman and his wife has shaken the nation. Back in February, Gene Hackman and his wife were found dead inside their Santa Fe home. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, suffered from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. It's a rare virus that is carried by rodents. She passed away at the age of 65. Officials say Gene Hackman died days later, suffering from heart disease with Alzheimer's disease as a contributing factor. He was 95. One of the family's dogs was also found dead inside its crate. As investigators work to unravel this case, the tragic events surrounding their death have raised questions, especially when it comes to estate planning. Joining me today is Kelsey Simasko of Simasko Law. The circumstances surrounding Gene and Betsy's death are pretty bizarre. After reading about this case and kind of following it, what comes to your mind as an elder law attorney and wealth management expert?
So what's funny is what really comes to my mind is something from law school. And it's what happens if you either pass away at the same time as your spouse or you predecease someone, right? And it's this funky rule called the 120 hours rule. Most people think, okay, if I pass away before my spouse, I just have to survive them by seconds, right? Because I passed first, my spouse passed second, it is what it is.
Right.
However, most states follow the 120 hours rule that says in order for you to be considered surviving spouse or surviving someone, you have to survive them by 120 hours. And that's 5 days. 5 days. And so, if you and I were in the car together and we got into a car accident, they would say that we died at the same time if you didn't survive me by 5 days.
Wow.
Right? And so for cases like this, that's really important because if wife survives husband, everything goes to her. She can do whatever the heck she wants with it. At that point, it would be going to her family members, right? So that's the very classic case of you marry someone a lot younger than you. You want to make sure your money goes to your adult children, not your new spouse's children from a different marriage. This case is funny because at first we all were thinking that she passed away 1 week before him, right? And so, all right, there you go. We made it the 120 hours. She predeceased him. It is what it is. If, though, less than that, then that's going to open the doors for a lot of questions. Luckily, for his children, for Gene's children, they want her to pass away before that 120 hours, right? They want this stepmom to be considered predeceasing their dad. And that's really the only way that they could inherit, right? And so that 120-hour rule is huge. It also is making me think of why it's so important to think of contingency plans. Everyone thinks that, all right, I'm going to pass away first and then my spouse will pass away after me. Well, what happens if you pass away at the same time? Right? What happens if you pass away in that muddy 120 hours spot where at that point you're going to be considered passing away together. And if you don't list who's supposed to collect after your spouse, it's got to go to probate.
It was first reported that Gene didn't leave or name his 3 children as beneficiaries in his estate, but I was reading a report from News Nation that said that his estate could still go to his children if there were no other beneficiaries named. And I guess there were some court filings that showed that his children were named as heirs, I think, in their will. So since Betsy died, the children could attempt to claim Hackman's estate as his only living heirs. Can you kind of explain how that would work?
Yeah, so what happens with that is it goes back to, if you don't name who's supposed to collect under your estate documents, then you're leaving it for the law to figure it out, right? The law, frankly, doesn't care if there's a million news reports about how much you and your kids didn't get along. The law doesn't care if you went on TMZ and said, I hate these kids. I don't want them to collect a penny. If you don't put that in writing, it's all meaningless, right? And so if he put in his documents, under no circumstances do I want my children to get it, but if my wife predeceases me, I don't know who gets it, that's going to be a harder time for the kids. Yeah. Because even though he doesn't say who's supposed to get it, he's saying not these guys, right?
Right.
So the court could look to more distant family members, right? Maybe an uncle, an aunt, a niece, a nephew. But I mean, truly, the way to make sure that this doesn't happen is by saying, I want my spouse to collect. If my spouse predeceases me, then I want the Humane Society to collect, right? Because by operation of law, the law isn't allowed to say, well, we decide your kids don't get anything and it's all going to the Humane Society, right? The law has to follow what the law says. And the law says if you don't determine who gets your stuff, it's going to go to your family members, whether you wanted them to or not.
Right. And is that because it's like his money? Like it wasn't, it's not really Betsy's. I mean, I know they were like married and if she was alive.
But it's not. It's not. And this is what kills me. So there are so many people who say, well, there was a prenup. Well, there was a prenup. Guess what? A prenup doesn't matter. A prenup only contemplates divorce. It does nothing in the face of death, right? And so if if it's determined that him and his wife, let's say, passed away at the same time, it all is still Gene's stuff. The only way it could be considered Betsy is if she survived him by that 120 hours. If she did, then it would go to her heirs at law, right? If she didn't name anyone else. But if she didn't survive him those 120 hours, it's going to be going to his heirs at law because he didn't specify otherwise.
You know what I don't get is why is that like such a hard concept to understand? Because I feel like we run into this situation a lot, especially when like these high profile celebrities with multi-million-dollar estates die. Like there's ambiguity in their documents or there's multiple versions. It seems like such a simple concept. How hard is it to just plainly say what you want, but like not doing so just opens up a whole can of worms.
And what I'm kind of thinking back to is the Aretha Franklin case, where she had a will, it was all, airtight, and then they found the handwritten will in the couch cushion, right? A case like that, it's more of she decided she wanted to make some changes and she didn't feel like going to see her lawyer, right? Honestly, as, silly as that sounds, understandable. We live in Michigan. The weather's not great, right? And if you're not trying to leave your house, in the winter, I'm sure you would think, let me just write something out really quick. But what's so troubling for me on this case is all of these documents were prepared by lawyers. And, I try not to throw around the M word, but it does seem a little bit, kind of like malpractice if you have this high net worth, high profile individual and you're not going to make them bake in these contingency plans, right? I honestly just said to my last client who I was with before we started talking about how, technically you don't have to think that next step ahead. You technically don't have to, but I as a practitioner feel it's really irresponsible not to.
Yeah.
Right? I trust myself. I think I'm a great driver. But I don't know if everyone else is a great driver. If I get hit by a drunk driver and me and my spouse die at the same time, even though it wasn't my fault, it's still my job to think of a contingency plan.
Yeah. And is a contingency plan like technically your backup?
Yeah. And I think of it as my contingency plan is I want everything to go to my spouse. But if my spouse can't collect, then I want it to go to my niece and my nephew. But if they can't collect, then I want it to go to the Humane Society, right? Some people will only think one or two steps down because so much has to happen for it to get to that fourth, fifth, sixth rung that it's kind of not worth it. But if you're someone who knows that you do not want your children to get a dime, you need to make sure that you're sitting down with your lawyer and saying, I don't care what happens, we're planning for everything. Those are the hardest conversations for me to have with people. It's the hardest thing to bring up because no one wants to think, well, what happens if my daughter predeceases me? What happens if my much younger spouse predeceases me? But you just never know what's going to happen.
How do you go about having that conversation?
Honestly, you just have to look at them and say, all right, who do you want to collect? Your wife? All right, if your wife predeceases you, who should collect? And I'm a big fan of you ask the hard question and then you add a little levity, right? And so I say, all right, if your wife predeceases you, who do you want to collect? Because if you rob a bank, husband, I'm sure your wife is the getaway driver and you're going down Thelma and Louise style. Right. And that usually is like, oh, yeah, that's right. We are together all the time. You know, that's a good question. A lot of times, and it's funny because these people are a little more common than you think, where some people kind of like to think that way, right? Because they're like, yeah, I do hope that if I pass away in an untimely accident, that I am with all of my loved ones, right? If I'm going down, I hope we all go down together. And so they're a little more willing to think, all right, my children and then my grandchildren and then my nieces and nephews, right?
Yeah.
But really, you know, being an estate planning lawyer and being an elder law attorney is about having those hard conversations. And if I'm uncomfortable asking questions and I let that impact my client's plan, I'm not doing my job as a lawyer. And frankly, I should be going down for that. Because it's my job to ask the hard questions. It's my job to say, well, have you ever considered this? And even if it is uncomfortable, guess what? Going and seeing the lawyer is uncomfortable. But we have to get through that to be able to make a rock solid plan.
Yeah, because without one, your stuff's going to it's going to be in the hands of a judge.
Yeah. And when this is the thing. If, we could resurrect Gene Hackman, if we could go back in time to when he made this plan, and if I could say, listen, would you rather have a hard conversation today and make your plan airtight so we won't have issues years from now? Or would you rather not have the hard conversation today and have the war later? Everyone is going to say, hard conversation today. Yeah. I want the hard conversation today. Because ultimately, for his situation, the way things turned out, it doesn't matter if he really had a plan or not, because the plan didn't contemplate what's going on. And when your plan doesn't contemplate that, it's all up to a probate judge to figure it out. And the reason you make a trust is to avoid probate.
And they had one, right? They had like a living trust, I think I saw.
My understanding is they had a trust. It's funny because there's, what the law says and then there's what actually happens.
Yeah.
In practice, a trust will totally avoid probate so long as no one's fighting and bringing it into probate, right? But when you leave enough ambiguity to send us into probate and there's not the plain language allowing a judge to shut it down and get it out of there, there's nothing we can do, right? And so if Gene Hackman's kids brought this into probate and said, Judge, this isn't fair, I should be collecting, if the judge could read that line that says, under no circumstances should my biological children be collecting, the judge will say, you guys are right. This is an issue and we need to be in probate, but you guys aren't the right parties to bring the issue, right?
Is that because, they weren't named anywhere on the trust?
If you're specifically excluded and you're not named anywhere on the documents, a judge very well can say, buzz off, get out of here. You don't belong in this courtroom. Because your dad told me that you don't, right? But dad never said under no circumstances should these people be collecting. And so now they're coming in saying, well, judge, you have to figure out what to do with it. And under law, we're the rightful heirs.
I want to pivot just a little bit because from what I've read, Betsy served as Gene's primary caregiver. Like he wasn't in a nursing home or anything like that. To my knowledge, there wasn't like and there very well could have been, but I haven't seen anything where it said like there was a professional caregiver that came in and kind of gave her a break. So it almost seems like once she died, he was kind of like out of luck.
That's absolutely what happened. And it's it's devastating.
Yeah.
It's devastating because you never expect your much younger spouse to pass away before you, right? And because you never expect that, you never think, well, wow, we should put some protocols in place, right? And so it's interesting because this case really has made me change the way I think about family caregivers, right? Where even if you want to keep it private and you want to keep it in the family, you still have to have a way to, wave the red flag, right? And so for a lot of families, even for my own, right? Like my elderly family members, they have a lot of independence and they're not interested in giving that up, right? And I really don't want to take it away from them. And so my compromise has been, that's fine, but you have to have a Ring doorbell that's connected to my phone.
Yeah.
Because if I see that no one's been going out for, 4 or 5 days, I'm going to know to get worried, right? Because guess what? Grandma always leaves the house. Or if I have that Ring doorbell on and I see that my dad with dementia is wandering outside all the time, I'm going to say, oh God, I got to get over and, put pants on dad.
Right.
But in this case, it was hard because it seems like, and it's hard to talk about all this when you don't exactly know what happened, but it does seem like he was pretty isolated on purpose. It seems like they both were.
Yes.
And when you're intentionally isolating yourself, you don't want to give his kids the Ring doorbell password so they can see what you're doing, right? That's completely contrary to what you're actively trying to do.
Yes.
But, when you leave someone in the position where, all right, if I'm the full-time caregiver and I fall and break my hip, I need a way to contact the emergency authorities so I can get sent to the hospital, right? Caretakers so often forget to take care of themselves, right? And you really need to think, all right, well, what happens if I go down?
Especially if you're taking care of someone, I feel like, who's like cognitively impaired, like he was. He wasn't even in his right mind.
Exactly. And, if she's on the floor needing help, how is he supposed to know what to do? He probably doesn't even know his own name, let alone 911. And so, and I know so many people are against them and they think it's so dorky, but life alerts, right? Something like that where you don't even wear it all the time, but you have one in every room so that if it all hits the fan, you can wiggle down on the floor and grab it, right?
Yeah. The
hard thing though is, if she passed away in her sleep, right? And there was just nothing anyone could do about it. Then it gets into, all right, well, are the family going to start calling the welfare tax? I'm sure they've tried that in the past while they were both still alive. And I'm sure that righteously pissed off Betsy.
Yeah.
And so second marriages, third marriages, they're pretty tricky to handle. One thing that I really urge all families to consider is that you need to pick your team, right? It can't just be the two of you. You have to pick your team, whether they're related to you or not. It takes a village to take care of someone like that. And you need your village not only looking out for the person you're taking care of, you need your village to look out for you, right? Because I'm sure she had friends she was in contact with, a lot of days. Tell them, listen, if you don't hear from me for 24 hours, call the police.
Right.
Right? 48 hours is the limit. If you don't hear from me and I don't pick up my phone, get the hell over here.
Yeah.
And so it's hard though, because, part of that is asking for help. And especially in, the United States, like we are all so proud. But
we're very individualistic almost.
We are. And so, if you're taking care of someone, become friends with the neighbor. And like I was listening to a true crime podcast, and it was a young woman who lived next door to an elderly couple. And this elderly couple really looked out for her and said, every night, turn on the lamp in front of your window. And that's how I know you're home and you're safe in your bed, right? She went missing one day. The lamp didn't go on. The neighbors were on it. The neighbors called immediately the next morning, right? You need a little system like that in place. Yeah. Even if it's just, hey, Jim across the street, we're both going to go out and get the mail every day at 10 o'clock. If I'm not out there and I didn't tell you, please come over and check on me.
Yes. Yeah.
But equally, when you have a lot of money and you're living in a big house, usually you don't have close by neighbors.
Right. I think that, that's what makes this so bizarre, is that, like, there was no other people that were coming in and checking on them or raising questions. Like, I've read where people were, like, concerned, but it's crazy how long, like, she was dead for days in the house, and so was he,
Yeah.
you know? Like, that's crazy.
And honestly, let this be a call to action to everyone. That concern is fine, but concern without action means nothing, right? I can sit here all day and say, wow, I'm so worried about my friend. I hope they're okay. What good does that do? Call them, text them, show up.
Yeah.
The worst thing that can happen is they say, oh, what are you doing here? And you say, oh my gosh, you're fine. Great. All right. You didn't answer the phone. I'm leaving. Love you. Bye. Right?
Right.
Take the initiative. Take the initiative. Even if you feel like you're being weird doing it, I would rather go down in history as the person who cared too much about the people around me than the person who could have done something and just didn't make the call.
Right.
And kind
of piggybacking off of that, if you are someone who thinks that you're going to, like, serve as the primary caregiver for a spouse or something like that, what should you keep in mind, and how can you kind of avoid this whole situation?
I mean, if you have the financial means to do it, just even as a fail-safe for you, have a caregiver come over once a week, right? Have someone come over once a week to do the laundry and, make a couple dinners. Just so that you at least know, all right, every Thursday, Amy is coming over, and if, I'm laying on the floor, well, Amy's going to find me, right?
Right.
It's tricky because, in-home care is expensive, and even having someone come one day a week is pretty expensive. And so, for us normies out there who don't have unlimited passive money, truly the answer is become friends with your neighbors, right? Become friends with your neighbors. If you're a caregiver who doesn't live in the home, still become friends with those neighbors. Because if you see something funky on the Ring doorbell, well, guess what? Sherry next door is going to be able to get over there a lot faster than me, who lives 5 miles away, right? And if I can call Sherry and say, hey, girl, I need you to go knock on the door and check on them, she's probably going to do it. And everyone in the world is longing for a sense of community. Everyone is. Everyone is longing for a sense of connection. And so take those first steps and make those connections, because as uncomfortable as it feels to do it for the first couple times, it's going to feel really good, because you at least know that if the worst thing happens in the world, you can send out, the twilight howl, and everyone next to you is going to come running.
Right. I also think when it comes to, like, long-term care planning, just knowing, okay, I'm going to take care of my husband, and assuming that, one, he's going to fall ill before you do, and just kind of stopping at, okay, we know who's going to take care of him isn't enough. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I feel like you still do. Does there still need to be a plan for, like let's say she died, like she did before him, but he didn't die right away. Where was he going to go? Like, does he go to the hospital? Does he go to a nursing home? Like, what? There needs to be more.
If I was the person who, came across that situation, my first thought would be, all right, let's take him to the hospital. Let's get him checked out to make sure that he's not dehydrated. Let's get him checked out to make sure, there are no broken bones or anything like that. And then once you have that figured out, then you start thinking of placement, right? For someone like him, it very well could be, all right, we're going to hire a nurse to come in and take care of you 24/7, right? For other people, it could be, all right, now we need to start looking at adult foster homes or assisted living or independent living or, nursing homes. But I usually say the hospital is going to be your best starting point, because at least then you have somewhere to take them. While they're being checked out for a couple hours, you can go run your errands and start touring the places that you think might be a possibility for them, or start interviewing those care workers. Or even you bring her to the hospital, you find the social worker and you say, I am so in over my head, I don't know what to do. What do I do? And the social worker will say, all right, here's the plan. This is what you got to do. If you need help, attorneys are always reaching out to, social workers and, care coordinators at these facilities and saying, if you have someone who needs help, have them call me. Right.
Yeah.
And so if you do that and your social worker says, look, I don't really know how to help you, call this attorney, call that attorney.
Yeah.
call them as soon as possible. Because in these situations, time is really of the essence. Once you're in the hospital, you've bought yourself some time, but the hospital is going to want to, turn over that bed eventually.
Yeah.
And so you got to be thinking of what that, part B is going to look like while you're still in part A.
Yeah. And I guess that probably applies too to like if you think or okay, my child's going to take care of me or my spouse is if something happens to me, but you probably still need to in your estate plan okay, well, if something happens to both of them and they can't take care of me, then I want to go here,
Yeah. Or even, just have those conversations with the family members where so that if it's not written down somewhere, I know, if daughter and son can't act, but that person's sister comes out and says, hey, we've had these conversations. This is what they probably want to do. That's going to be a much better starting point than the social worker, right? Because as much as we can keep it in the family and keep that person's wishes effectuated, we want to. And I know for me, I tell my sister everything, right? And so I've told everyone around me, if Lauren comes out and tells you to do something for me, do it. She's the one who's going to know, right?
Right.
And so having the conversations with some extra people who aren't just your children in case that happens, right? I always say plan for the best, prepare for the worst. And it's all you can really do.
Aside from the money, what will happen now with the rest of their assets, like the home, the cars, what happens now? Who gets that stuff? Who goes through it?
It's all going to sit there.
Really?
It literally is all going to sit there until they can get it figured out. Because usually the documents would say, all right, this person is in charge of getting everything together, of starting to secure the house, of doing, X, Y, Z. If that person was spouse and spouse isn't around to do it, if the documents don't name someone and don't allow the attorney to put someone in place, everything just has to sit there until probate gives someone authority.
So what happens if the kids start going in there and sniffing around? Can they get in trouble? I know that's a tough question.
Right? Yes and no. They can because technically it's not theirs yet. Court has not signed anything over to you. And so on one hand, you are trespassing. If you're, going in and you're like, listen, judge, I need to go change the locks and clean out the fridge, right? That's going to be a little different. There's a big difference between going in and taking stuff and going in just to clean out the fridge, right? We can't have bugs crawling around. And so someone has to secure the property. But before anyone is going to do any kind of property securing, especially in a matter where people are fighting, you have to go through the court. Because if you don't, those people you're fighting with are going to use it against you. They're going to say, Your Honor, I've been sitting here patiently doing what I'm supposed to do, and my brother went through the house and, I don't know what he took, right? That's going to be a problem for brother. Brother is going to get in trouble for that. Versus if brother has just been pestering the court saying someone has to get in there and change the lock. Someone has to get in there and, clean out the fridge. Get court authority before you do anything. Yeah. Because cases like this, a lot of the time, I think of it as you're divorcing your family members. You're divorcing your siblings. You're trying to, divorce your parent. And in divorces, people are keeping score. People are making lists to hold things against you. And so act like you're always being watched because you are.
There was obviously a big age gap between them, 30 years. How should estate plans be handled for couples with large age gaps?
Pretend like you're both going to pass away at the same time. Just tell yourself that that's what's going to happen, right? Because if you had your bets on your spouse passing away after you, your much younger spouse, something's going to go wrong. Something's going to go wrong because when you fail to prepare, what is it? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right?
Yeah.
If you pretend like you're both going to pass away in the same jet skiing accident on your honeymoon or the same car accident at home, you're going to put all of those contingency plans in place. But also know that if you go to an attorney, right, you're an age gap couple and you're going to an attorney and they don't bring up a contingency plan, run as fast as you can. Run. Because that person obviously either doesn't know what they're doing or they don't care, right? I don't know what's worse. I think that someone who doesn't know what they're doing is better than someone who just plain doesn't care.
Yeah.
Because there's a difference between a genuine mistake from inexperience and negligence, right?
Yeah.
Either way, your situation is going to look different than the typical nuclear families. And so you need to go to an attorney who has experience with that. Every attorney is going to say, oh, yeah, I can do that. Ask if they've done it before, right? Ask if they've done it before. I'll give you an example. I did an estate plan for a couple with a 45-year age gap a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And honestly, it was awesome because they both came in and they were like, listen, I'm anticipating that, my younger spouse is going to survive me. But I also know that my kids are pretty mad I married a younger guy, right? And in light of that, I need to make sure that this younger guy isn't going to be running into issues from my kids down the line. All right, I can do that for you, no problem, right? But if you go to the attorney who just started doing wills and trusts, right, and they don't do any kind of probate litigation, and they don't do anything with contested trust, you maybe shouldn't be going to them. Because the way you know how to word these things is because you've seen it go wrong and you know what should have been done. You need to feel comfortable with who you're using. And even if they come with, the heaviest price tag and the shiniest suit, the best looking office, they might not be the person for you if you really don't feel comfortable with them. So make sure you're comfortable. Make sure they're asking questions that make you go, I never thought of that. And if they don't, give a second opinion.
The two big takeaways from this case are, one, don't assume like there's an order to when people die. Don't assume that your husband's going to predecease you or the other way around. Like anything can happen and you need to have a plan that can adapt with that and that is safeguarded for that.
Yeah. And
then I think the second takeaway is there needs to be a contingency plan.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the takeaway is really prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
All right, that does it for this edition of Not Your Father's 2 Cents. Sources used in this episode will be linked in the description. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you back here next week.